Welcome back to Mr. Dreadmere tonight. I have 8 true terrifying night fishing horror stories before we begin. Make sure you're subscribed, because once you step onto the Mr. Dreadmere, you don't walk alone. I had just finished setting the second line when the first one snapped tight so hard, it yanked the rod butt against the railing and nearly tore it out of my hands. I lunged, grabbed it, and felt that deep, wrong weight travel straight up my arms and into my chest. Not a fish. I knew that immediately. Fish fight you in pulses. This was steady, deliberate, like something on the other end had decided to move and expected me to come with it. I leaned back, boots scraping, and muttered out loud just to hear a human voice. Easy, easy. The reel screamed once, then stopped, locked solid. The line wasn't peeling out. It wasn't snapping either. It was just there, humming, vibrating like a live wire. I remember thinking I must have snagged old scrap, maybe a sunken beam or an engine block dumped years back. It wouldn't have been the first time. Then the pull shifted, not down, not sideways, upstream. I froze. The current in that slow never reversed. I had worked these docks long enough to know every lazy swirl and stubborn eddy. The water moved one way, slow and brown, carrying whatever people didn't want to think about anymore. But my line started creeping the opposite direction, inch by inch, as if whatever I'd hooked was walking along the bottom against the flow. I tightened my grip until my knuckles burned, and looked around, expecting another boat, another line crossed. Nothing. The dock was empty. The mill lights were dark. I was alone with the sound of my own breathing and the faint, steady ticking of tension through graphite and steel. "Come on," I whispered, like you talk to a stuck drawer. "Don't do this." The rod bent deeper. I could feel the cork handle flexing under my palms. Whatever it wasn't lifting. It was dragging. I braced one foot against the railing and leaned back, heart hammering, trying to force it free. For a second, it gave, just a hair. Hope flared stupid and quick. Then the line pulled again, upstream, harder this time. I remember a sudden, sharp thought that didn't feel like mine. Let go. Just drop it. Go home. Pretend this never happened. That thought scared me more than the pull itself, because it felt like something you think right before you get hurt. I didn't let go. Instead, I started walking, keeping the rod high, following the line along the dock. Each step felt wrong, like I was being led. The wood under my boots creaked too loud. My breath sounded too fast. The line stayed tight, guiding me toward the far end, where the dock dipped closer to the water. "Hey," I said, louder now, stupidly addressing the river. "That's enough." The pull slowed, then stopped. The line went slack so suddenly I almost fell backward. I reeled fast, desperate to regain tension, afraid of what it meant if I didn't. The weight came back, heavier than before, settling deep, as if it had lain down. That was when I felt it move again, not upstream this time, but up. The rod tip jerked, lifting toward the surface, and for one wild second I thought something massive was about to break the water. I leaned forward, squinting, pulse roaring in my ears. Nothing surfaced. The water stayed dark and blank. But the weight shifted higher, closer, until I could feel it through the line, a dull, dragging scrape like metal on silt. My stomach dropped. Metal. I reeled until my forearms screamed. Whatever I had hooked didn't fight. It allowed itself to be pulled, slow and patient, inching closer to the dock. The smell hit first, a sour, trapped odor that didn't belong to open water. Then something pale rolled just under the surface, caught the faint dock light, and vanished again. I gagged and stepped back. "No," I said. No, the line snagged, went tight again, and the weight shifted sideways, bumping the dock with a low, hollow thud that vibrated through the boards. I dropped the rod without thinking and stared down. Just below the surface, I saw a shape, straight lines, angles, not natural, not a fish. A doorframe, maybe coated in slime, the glass long gone. The realization hit so hard it made my knees weak. It was a car. I stood there, shaking, watching my line disappear into the open window, hooked on something inside. The car rocked gently, nudged by the current like it was breathing. The pull on the line wasn't gone. It was still there, faint but insistent, tugging upstream as if the vehicle itself wanted to turn, to go back the way it had come. I backed away until my calves hit a piling. My mind raced, trying to find a clean explanation, tides shifting debris. Anything but what my gut was screaming. Then the line tightened again, sharp and sudden, and the rod I'd dropped skittered across the dock, clattering against the railing. That was it. I ran. I don't remember the drive home clearly. I remember my hands shaking on the wheel, the radio blasting nonsense just to drown out my thoughts. The way I kept checking the rearview mirror, like something might follow me off the water. I didn't sleep. I sat at my kitchen table until morning, staring at my hands, replaying the feel of that pull over and over. I went back after daylight. I don't know why. Maybe I needed to prove to myself I hadn't imagined it. Maybe part of me was afraid of what would happen if I didn't. The dock looked normal in the morning, harmless. The water slid by like it always had, hiding everything beneath a skin of ripples. My line was gone, snapped clean at the reel. I stood there a long time, heart pounding, until a harbor patrol boat eased up, its engine low and steady. They had already found it. A fisherman downstream had snagged the same thing after dawn and reported it. Divers were on their way. I listened as the officer talked, words washing over me in pieces. Submerged vehicle, tied off, deliberately sunk, the line still attached, running upstream to a piling, knotted, careful and tight. I felt cold all over. They asked if I'd seen anything unusual overnight. I told them everything, about the pull, about the way it moved against the current, about the shape under the water. The officer watched me closely, then nodded slow. "That makes sense," he said. "The line was rigged to catch. Whoever dumped it wanted it found eventually, or wanted something else. They pulled the car out that afternoon. I didn't watch. I didn't need to. I heard enough. It had been missing since late spring. A dock worker like me, different shift, different pier. He'd reported threats, trouble, then nothing. The car had been weighted, rolled in quiet, left to sit until someone like me came along with a hook and some bad luck. I quit fishing after that. I still work the docks, still hear the water moving past, carrying its secrets. Sometimes late at night, when everything is still, I swear I can feel that pull again, steady and patient, like the river remembering the way back. I was threading a fresh glow stick onto my line when I noticed the light across the water blink on, at the exact same moment as mine. I paused with the plastic tube half bent in my fingers, listening to it crackle to life, and watched the other glow stick hold steady on the far shore. It was too clean, too precise to be a coincidence, but I told myself that anyway. Cowichan Lake was quiet at night, but it wasn't empty. Other people fished. Other people liked glow sticks. I clipped mine into place and cast. The line asked out, the green light tracing a short, bright curve before it landed. Almost immediately, the glow across the lake moved too, lifting and settling in a way that mirrored my cast. My first thought was irritation. Whoever it was had terrible timing. I shifted my weight on the rocks and adjusted my stance. The glow on the opposite shore shifted the same way, left then right, a perfect echo. I frowned and leaned forward, squinting, trying to make out a silhouette behind the light. I couldn't see anyone. Just that floating dot of green suspended above the black water. Cute, I muttered, more annoyed than scared. I reeled in a little slack, testing the tension. The other glow stick reeled in at the same speed. I stopped. It stopped. I lifted my rod tip. It lifted too. My chest tightened. The way it does when something doesn't fit the shape it's supposed to. I told myself it was just perspective, that I was reading too much into it. So I did something random. I dipped the rod tip down, then up, then tapped it twice against the rock beside me. Across the lake, the light dipped, rose and blinked twice. I felt my stomach drop, a slow, heavy sinking that made my hands go cold. I stood very still listening, no footsteps, no voices, just the faint sound of water against stone and my own breathing, suddenly loud in my ears. "Hello," I called, hating the thinness in my voice. The glow stick across the lake held steady. Then it slid sideways, slow and smooth, as if someone were walking along the shore. I tracked it, heart pounding, until it stopped directly opposite me again. Perfectly aligned. I took a step back without looking, my heel slipping on gravel. The glow across the water didn't move. It stayed fixed on me, an unblinking green eye. I should have left then. I know that now. But there was a stubborn part of me that refused to be chased off by a light and my own imagination. I had driven out there to fish. I was tired. I was sick of being jumpy. So I forced myself to breathe, slow and deep, and cast again. The glow across the lake cast again. This time, I felt something snap inside me. Not fear exactly, but a cold, focused attention. I started experimenting, small movements at first. I rotated my wrist. The other light rotated. I crouched low. The other light dropped to the same height. I stood and raised my rod straight up over my head. The glow on the far shore lifted higher than before, stretching up until it hovered well above, where a person's head should have been. My mouth went dry. My arms ached from holding the rod up, but I didn't lower it. I couldn't stop staring. Slowly, deliberately, the glow stick across the lake bent, just like the plastic in my hand had bent earlier. I heard nothing, but I could imagine the faint crackle of chemicals activating, imagined it too vividly. The light flared brighter, then steadied. I dropped my rod. It clattered against the rocks, the glow stick on my line bouncing and skittering before settling. Across the lake, the other light dropped too, hitting the ground with a dull, soundless thud. That broke me. I grabbed my gear and ran, not caring how loud I was, not caring if someone saw me. I didn't look back until I reached my truck. When I did, the glow was still there, floating at the water's edge, steady and patient. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that light lifting higher than it should have, moving without a body, responding to me like it knew me. In the morning, I told myself I'd been overtired, that my depth perception had been off, that someone had been messing with me. By afternoon, I almost believed it. A few days later, I went into town for supplies and overheard two men talking near the bulletin board outside the general store. They were arguing in low voices, the kind people use when they don't want to be overheard but can't help themselves. They closed it off. One of them said, "That whole stretch. They can't just do that." The other replied, "People fish there all the time. They can, and they did. Until they figure out what happened to her." I stopped, my hand still on the door handle, and turned. Figure out what happened to who? They looked at me, surprised, then wary. One of them sighed. "A woman went missing last summer. Over on the far inlet. Never found her. Just her gear. They don't want people over there at night anymore." My pulse started to race. "Did she use glow sticks?" I asked. The men exchanged a look. "Yeah," one said slowly. "How did you know that?" I didn't answer. I drove back to the lake instead, my hands shaking on the wheel. The access road to the opposite shore was blocked with fresh signage and yellow tape. I stood there, staring across the water at the spot where I'd seen the light, trying to reconcile it with what I knew now. The official story came out weeks later. She'd slipped, fallen in, the lake had taken her. An accident. But there were details that didn't make the papers. Her glow sticks had been found arranged neatly along the shore, evenly spaced, all activated at once. I stopped fishing at night after that. I still go to the lake sometimes during the day, when everything looks harmless and ordinary, but I never bring glow sticks anymore. I don't need a light to know that something is watching from the other side, waiting to see who will signal first. I was already reaching for his rod when he said it, his small hands locked tight around the cork handle, knuckles pale in the moonlight. "Don't reel it in," he told me, calm as anything. The water said to wait. I laughed at first, the automatic kind you use to brush something off. But the laugh died halfway out of my throat, because he wasn't joking. He wasn't scared either. He was listening. We had been out longer than I meant to stay. Midnight had come and gone without either of us noticing, the way it does when you're focused on something simple and repetitive. Cast, wait, reel, check, bait, repeat. He was 9 then, skinny arms, too much energy even at that hour, begging me to let him stay just a bit longer. One more cast, one more chance. I told myself it was harmless. The backwater was shallow, familiar. I'd fished it since I was a kid myself. "Mate," I said, keeping my voice light, "it's late. You're tired." He shook his head without looking at me, eyes fixed on the dark patch where his line disappeared. "Not yet. It's not time." Something in my chest tightened. I told myself he was playing, feeding off the quiet, the weirdness of being up so late. Kids say strange things. Still, I crouched beside him and put a hand on the rod. The line was slack, resting on the surface, unmoving. "Nothing's biting," I said. "Let's pack it in." He leaned away from me, sudden and fierce. "You can't. It's holding something." I followed his gaze back to the water. It looked the same as it always did, slow and dark, barely moving. No ripples, no tug on the line, just stillness. I felt foolish for even humoring the moment, but a chill crept up my arms anyway. "What do you mean, holding something?" I asked. He swallowed. "It doesn't want to be alone anymore." That did it. I stood brushing dirt off my knees and reached down again, firmer this time. "Okay, that's enough. Reel it in." He didn't fight me. He just started crying, silent tears sliding down his cheeks as he loosened his grip. "You'll scare it?" he whispered. "Please." I stopped. I don't know why. Every sensible part of me said, take the rod, walk away, go home. But there was something in his voice I'd never heard before, something older than him, heavy and sure. I eased my hand back. 5 minutes, I said. "Then we go." He nodded, wiping his face with his sleeve, eyes never leaving the water. We waited. The minutes stretched, thick and uncomfortable. I kept checking my watch, counting down in my head, listening to the faint sounds around us. Somewhere far off, a motor hummed and faded. An insect buzzed near my ear. The water stayed still. Just as I opened my mouth to tell him time was up, the line twitched. It wasn't much, just a small, deliberate pull, like someone testing the weight on the other end. My heart kicked hard against my ribs. He sucked in a breath. "There," he said softly. "It knows." The line twitched again, then went still. I leaned closer, squinting, trying to see what he saw. The water reflected nothing but darkness. "Rail slowly," I told him, "just a little." He shook his head. "Not yet. It's stuck." I wanted to argue, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I watched his small hands tighten again, the rod tip dipping slightly under a weight that hadn't been there before. My mouth went dry. "Something's on there," I said, more to reassure myself than him. He nodded. "It's been there all night." A shiver ran through me. "What do you mean, all night?" He frowned, like I was missing something obvious. "Before we got here." I stood abruptly, scanning the shoreline, the water, the trees behind us. The place felt different, suddenly smaller, like the dark was pressing in. "We're done," I said, sharper than I meant to. "Right now." The line pulled again, stronger this time, not a quick bite, but a steady drag. The rod bent. My son grunted, bracing his feet. Instinct took over. I grabbed the rod above his hands, feeling the weight through the fiberglass, heavy and wrong. "This isn't a fish," I muttered. "No," he agreed. "It can't move." We stood there, both of us holding the rod, neither reeling, neither letting go. The pull didn't fight, it just stayed patient, like it knew we would tire first. Minutes passed. My arms began to ache, his started to shake. "Dad," he whispered, voice breaking. "It's getting cold, let go," I said. "Now," he hesitated, then released the rod. I took his place, heart pounding, and reeled with everything I had. The line came in slow, resistant, scraping against something below. I felt it through my palms, a dull vibration that made my skin crawl. Whatever was on the other end didn't surface. It stayed submerged, dragging closer, until the line went slack all at once. I nearly fell backward. I stared down, breath ragged. The hook came up empty, bait gone, line frayed. I laughed then, shaky and relieved. The sound too loud in the quiet. "See, nothing. Just got snagged." He didn't laugh. He was staring at the spot where the line had been, face pale. "It's still there," he said. We moved away from it. I packed up fast after that, hands clumsy, movements rushed. He stayed silent on the walk back to the car, head down, dragging his feet. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see something behind us. But there was nothing. At home, he fell asleep almost immediately, exhaustion finally catching up. I lay awake for hours replaying the night, telling myself I'd overreacted, that kids have vivid imaginations. By morning, the fear had dulled into something easier to carry. It came roaring back with the knock at the door. 2 officers stood on the porch, hats in hand, faces serious. They asked about the fishing spot, about the time we'd been there, about my son. My stomach dropped through the floor. They found remains at dawn, caught on submerged debris near the exact place we'd been fishing. A body that had been there for some time, held in place by the current. They asked if my son's line had been in the water overnight. I nodded numb. The investigation dragged on for months. They identified the remains eventually. A local man reported missing the year before. An accident, they said, slipped in, couldn't get out. The backwater held him fast. I never took my son fishing at night again. He doesn't talk about it much now, but sometimes, when we pass that stretch of water, he goes quiet, eyes tracking the surface. "It's empty now," he told me once. It doesn't need to wait anymore. I didn't ask how he knew. I just squeezed his shoulder and kept walking, grateful for the daylight, for the simple mercy of knowing when to reel in. I had just settled the rod into the railing when the water under the pier made a sound it wasn't supposed to make. A sharp splash followed by a slow, dragging swirl, like something heavy had been dropped and was still sinking. I leaned over, peering through the gaps between the boards, heart kicking once before I told myself it was nothing. Fish thrashed. Debris shifted. Wismar Harbor had been swallowing and regurgitating junk for centuries. Still, I listened. The sound came again, directly beneath my boots this time. Not loud, but deliberate. I straightened, scanning the empty stretch of pier behind me, then checked my watch out of habit. Just after midnight. Deadcom shift. Pier 17 had been out of use for years, which was exactly why I liked it. No supervisors wandering by. No dock workers complaining about hooks or lines. Just me, my uniform jacket shrugged open, and a few quiet hours to fish. I eased the line out and cast, the weight dropping cleanly through the air before disappearing between the boards. The splash echoed oddly, swallowed almost immediately by the stillness. I waited, feeling the familiar tension ease in my shoulders. Fishing was the only thing that made night shifts tolerable. It gave my hands something to do and my mind something to rest on. Below me, something splashed again. This time it wasn't random. It was too close, too controlled. I crouched, gripping the edge of the pier, and leaned down until my face was inches from the gap. The water below was black and flat, reflecting nothing. I couldn't see what made the sound, but I could feel it, a faint vibration through the wood, like a low hum. "Knock it off," I muttered, annoyed at myself for talking to the harbor. The line twitched gently. I smiled despite the unease and reeled in a touch of slack, waiting for the pull of a fish. Nothing. The line went slack again, drifting lazily. Another splash. This one was farther out, followed by a soft scraping noise that set my teeth on edge. It sounded like metal brushing wood. I stood, every sense sharpening. Pier 17 wasn't supposed to have traffic. Boats avoided it. That was the point. I grabbed my flashlight and swept the beam across the waterline. Nothing broke the surface. No boats. No ripples moving away. I told myself it was probably a seal or a big carp. The harbor had both. But seals surfaced. Carp thrashed. Whatever was down there stayed hidden, making just enough noise to let me know it was there. The line pulled suddenly, hard enough to bend the rod. I grabbed it, adrenaline spiking, and leaned back. The weight felt wrong immediately. Too heavy, too steady. It didn't surge or dart. It dragged slow and insistent, pulling straight down. "You've got to be kidding me," I said, bracing my feet. I reeled carefully, feeling resistance all the way. The scraping sound returned louder now, right beneath me. Wood creaked. The pier vibrated faintly, as if something was bumping against its supports. My mouth went dry. "What are you stuck on?" The line pulled sideways, then stopped. I held my breath, waiting for it to snap. It didn't. Instead, it tightened again, drawing taut like a rope under strain. I felt a cold prickle crawl up my spine. I shined the flashlight straight down. The beam caught something pale just under the surface, then slid off it. For a second, I thought I saw a hand. I blinked hard, heart pounding, and shined the light again. Nothing. I laughed shakily, the sound brittle. "Get a grip." I reeled faster, muscles burning, determined to bring whatever it was up and end the mystery. The resistance increased, then shifted. The scraping grew louder, unmistakable now. Metal on wood. The rod bent nearly double. "Jesus," I whispered. Then the line went slack. I stumbled back, nearly losing my footing, and stared down at the water. The flashlight beam wavered over the surface, catching only my own reflection. The silence pressed in, heavy and complete. I reeled in the line, hands trembling. The hook came up empty, bent slightly out of shape. I stared at it, trying to make sense of what I'd felt. Whatever it had caught on hadn't been natural. It had moved. I should have packed up then, gone back to my patrol route, and pretended none of it happened. Instead, I sat on a crate and lit a cigarette, hands shaking too much to hide it. I told myself I needed a minute. That was all. The splashing started again, farther down the pier this time. Not frantic, rhythmic, like someone wading carefully through shallow water. "Hello," I called, the word coming out hoarse. The splashing stopped. I stood, every nerve screaming, and scanned the length of Pier 17. The board stretched it out empty and grey, vanishing into darkness. No footsteps, no voices, just the faint lap of water against wood. I radioed it in, keeping my voice neutral. Possible debris or activity under Pier 17. Requesting check at first light. The dispatcher acknowledged board. I didn't blame him. I sounded ridiculous even to myself. The rest of the shift dragged. I didn't fish again. I paced, checked locks that didn't need checking, jumped at every creek. When dawn finally broke, I felt wrung out and foolish, convinced I'd imagined the whole thing. By noon, they'd found the barrels. Divers went down under Pier 17 and came back up pale and quiet. Metal drums, chained together, sunk deliberately. Some were leaking. The smell carried even above the water, sharp and chemical. The harbor authorities sealed off the area within hours. The investigation exploded from there. Organized dumping. Ties to a crime group operating along the coast. Evidence of worse things hidden in the deeper channels. Pier 17 became a crime scene, swarming with people who hadn't believed me the night before. They asked me to walk them through everything I'd heard, everything I'd felt. When I described the scraping, the sideways pull, one of the investigators nodded slowly. They move them sometimes, he said. Adjust the chains. Make sure nothing surfaces. While I was there, I asked. He met my eyes. Probably. I don't fish anymore. Not at night. Not anywhere quiet. I still work security, still walk the docks. But I keep my distance from Pier 17. It's empty again now. Quiet as ever, like nothing happened. Sometimes when the harbor goes still, I hear splashing under the boards and remember the weight on the line. The way it pulled without fighting, and I know that calm water doesn't mean nothing is moving underneath. I was already annoyed before I realized something was wrong, standing ankle deep in the mud with my phone balanced on a rock, watching the signal bars drop from 3 to nothing the moment my lure hit the water. The screen flickered, went blank, then showed no service at all. I frowned and lifted the rod, thinking it was just bad coverage, but as soon as the line cleared the bend and came back toward me, the signal jumped right back like nothing had happened. I stared at the phone, then at the water. That's strange, I said out loud, mostly to hear my own voice. I had been fishing that tidal creek alone for hours without a problem. It was one of my favorite spots. Quiet enough that I could think, familiar enough that I didn't feel foolish being there by myself. The bend in the creek wasn't special, just a shallow curve where the water slowed and darkened before narrowing again. I'd cast there dozens of times before, never noticed anything odd. I shrugged, reset the lure, and cast again, aiming deliberately for the same place. The phone buzzed in my hand as the signal died instantly. I felt a ripple of unease that had nothing to do with technology. It was too precise. I reeled in, slow and careful, eyes fixed on the screen. The bars climbed back up as soon as the lure cleared the water. I laughed once, short and uneasy. You're imagining things. A still. I didn't cast again right away. I checked the time, checked my messages, even opened a browser page just to make sure everything worked. It did, perfectly until I cast again. The moment the line asked and settled into that bend, my phone went dead. No service, no data, nothing. I felt my shoulders tense, the way they do when your body reacts before your brain catches up. I looked around, suddenly aware of how alone I was. The creek curved out of sight on either side, the banks rising just enough to block the road. I couldn't hear traffic. I couldn't hear anyone else. Just the faint movement of water and my own breathing. Okay, I said quietly. Enough. I reeled in and stepped back from the edge, half expecting the phone to stay dead just to prove a point. It didn't. Full signal again. I told myself it was interference, some strange dead zone caused by the shape of the land. That made sense. It had to. I packed up and moved downstream, choosing a new spot where the water was wider and faster. I cast there without issue. The phone stayed connected. My heartbeat slowed. I fished for another hour, forcing myself to relax, telling myself I'd let a coincidence get under my skin. But my thoughts kept drifting back to that bend. The way the signal dropped instantly, the way it returned just as fast. I tried to let it go. I really did. On my way back to the car, I stopped without meaning to. I stood there, staring at the water, rod resting against my hip. The bend looked the same as always, harmless, ordinary. One more, I murmured, mostly out of stubbornness. I cast. The phone died so completely this time that the screen went black. Not even a warning. Just gone. My pulse spiked. I shook the phone, pressed the button, held it down. Nothing. I reeled in fast, heart thudding, eyes flicking between the water and the screen. The moment the lure cleared the surface, the phone powered back on, vibrating in my hand like it had been waiting. I stepped back hard enough to splash mud onto my jeans. That was when I noticed the mark on the bank. It was faint, easy to miss. Just a scuffed patch of earth half hidden by grass. A footprint, maybe pressed deep and uneven, like someone had lost their balance there. I crouched, examining it, my skin prickling. There was another one nearby, and another, leading away from the water toward the brush. I stood slowly, every sense alert now. The air felt heavier, charged. I suddenly didn't want to be there anymore. I left without casting again. I didn't tell anyone at first. It sounded ridiculous when I tried to explain it even to myself. Phones lose signal. People slip near water. My imagination had filled in the rest. A week later, I saw the police cars. They were parked along the narrow road by the creek, lights flashing without sirens. The sight sent a cold wave through me. I pulled over without thinking, heart hammering, and watched from a distance as officers taped off the exact bend I'd been avoiding. I got out of the car and walked closer, drawn by something I couldn't name. One of the officers noticed me and raised a hand. "Can I help you?" "I fish here," I said, my voice sounding far away to my own ears. "What's going on?" He hesitated, then sighed. "We're investigating an incident. You didn't see anything unusual recently, did you?" My mouth went dry. Images flashed through my mind: the dead phone, the scuffed earth, the sudden certainty that something wasn't right. "What kind of incident?" I asked. He studied my face for a long moment, then spoke carefully. "An assault. Unreported. We have reason to believe it happened here." The words hit me like a physical blow. "When?" "Last year," he said. "The victim only came forward recently. Details led us back to this location." I nodded numbly, my thoughts racing. "My phone," I blurted. "I know this sounds strange, but my phone loses signal whenever I cast right there. Only there." The officer's expression changed, sharpening. "You should come down to the station and tell someone that." So I did. I told them everything, every detail I could remember, every odd sensation, every moment of unease I'd brushed aside. They listened without interrupting, writing notes, exchanging glances. When I finished, one of them nodded slowly. "The victim said she couldn't call for help," he said. "Her phone wouldn't connect. She thought it was broken." I closed my eyes, a heavy sadness settling in my chest. Did it happen right there? Wes! They found more evidence in the following days. Items lost in the struggle. Marks on the bank that time hadn't erased completely. My strange experience became one small piece in a larger, uglier picture. I stopped fishing that creek after that. Not because I was afraid of it, but because I couldn't stand the thought of standing there again. knowing what had happened in that quiet bend, while the world stayed connected everywhere else. Sometimes I still think about the way the signal vanished so cleanly, like the place itself swallowed sound, like silence had weight. And I wonder how many warnings we miss because they don't look like the ones we expect. I bent to lift the bucket with one hand the way I always did, and nearly wrenched my shoulder out of its socket. The handle bit into my palm, and the bucket didn't move an inch. For a split second, I thought my footing had slipped on the planks, but when I adjusted and tried again, bracing with both hands, the weight stayed stubbornly where it was, like it had fused itself to the dock overnight. What the hell? I muttered, breath fogging in front of my face. That bucket hadn't weighed more than a few kilos when I left it there the night before. Just herring and ice. Split costs with two other guys who fished the inlet whenever our schedules lined up. We'd tied it off to a cleat, planning to be back before dawn. That was the routine. Nothing fancy, nothing secret. I crouched and peered inside, expecting to see it overfilled with water. The lid was still snapped on, the same cheap plastic one with the crack along the rim. I popped it open. The smell hit first, sharp and chemical, not fishy at all. I recoiled instinctively, heart jumping, then leaned back in, confused. The ice was gone, replaced by tightly wrapped bundles, black plastic slick with moisture. They were packed so neatly they looked deliberate, stacked right up to the rim. I just stared, my mind scrambling to catch up. This wasn't bait. This wasn't anything that belonged to me. My first stupid thought was that someone had pranked us, but the weight of the bucket said otherwise. I touched one of the bundles with the tip of my finger. It was hard, dense. Definitely not a joke. I snapped the lid shut and looked around, suddenly very aware of how exposed I was. The inlet was quiet, the docks mostly empty at that hour. A gull cried somewhere far off. I felt like every shadow had eyes. Don't touch it, I told myself. Just walk away. But my hands wouldn't stop shaking. Questions piled up faster than I could answer them. Who would use a shared bait bucket to stash something like this? Why here? Why overnight? I backed away, then forced myself to breathe. I fished these docks. I worked them. I knew how things moved through Prince Rupert. How cargo slipped in and out quietly if you knew where to look. I'd heard rumors like everyone else, but hearing rumors and standing over a bucket full of evidence were two very different things. I fumbled for my phone and called one of the other guys, hoping he'd answer and tell me this was some elaborate mistake. He didn't pick up. I called the second, straight to voicemail. My stomach sank. I stood there too long, I know that now. I should have walked straight to the harbor office or called the police immediately. Instead, I kept glancing at the bucket, at the knot on the rope that hadn't been mine, tight and new against the cleat. Someone had been there after we left. Someone careful. A low engine noise drifted across the water, distant but approaching. Panic spiked. I grabbed the bucket again, muscles straining, and dragged it a few inches back from the edge, the plastic scraping loudly against the dock. The sound seemed to echo forever. The engine cut. Footsteps approached from the far end of the pier. "Hey!" A voice called out. "You all right down there?" I straightened fast, heart pounding. It was just a dock worker I recognized, one of the early shift guys. I forced a smile that probably looked more like a grimace. "Yeah," I said. "Just something weird with the bait." He laughed. "That's fishing." I nodded, not trusting myself to say more. He didn't come closer, just waved and headed off toward the warehouses. I waited until he was gone before I moved again. That was when the fear settled in properly, heavy and cold. Whatever was in that bucket wasn't meant to be found by someone like me. It was meant to move quietly overnight, from one hand to another. And now it was sitting there, tied to my name by nothing more than bad timing. I finally did the sensible thing and called it in. The response was faster than I expected. Officers arrived, then more, then people who didn't introduce themselves at all. The bucket was photographed, tagged, lifted with care. I answered questions until my throat was dry. They asked about the other fishermen, about who had access to the pier, about anything unusual I'd seen in recent weeks. As the morning wore on, the scope of it became clear. The bundles weren't just contraband. They were part of a larger shipment, one piece of a route that threaded through the harbor, exploiting blind spots and routines. The shared bucket was supposed to be temporary, a clever hiding place no one would question. Except I had. The investigation dragged on for months. There were raids, arrests, stories in the paper that danced around the details without naming names. I was interviewed more times than I could count. Each time, I told the same story, reliving that moment when the bucket refused to move, when my ordinary night turned into something else entirely. I stopped fishing after that, not because I lost the taste for it, but because every time I touched a bucket or tied off a line, I felt that weight again, heavier than it should have been, pulling at me. Prince Rupert kept moving goods in and out like it always had. The harbor didn't change. I did. Even now, years later, I can still feel that handle biting into my palm, the surprise and dread crashing together in my chest. It taught me how thin the line is between the ordinary and the dangerous, how easily you can stumble into someone else's darkness just by showing up at the wrong time. And every time I passed that pier, I glanced down, half expecting to see another bucket waiting there, heavier than it has any right to be. He said, or one, so quietly at first that I almost didn't hear him. His eyes locked on the rod tip as it gave a small, deliberate twitch. I nodded without looking over, adjusting my own line, thinking it was just a child's way of staying engaged. He liked counting things. Steps, birds, cars. Bites were no different. I smiled to myself, enjoying the calm of it, the simple rhythm of standing side by side with him on the flats. "Too," he said a moment later, a little louder this time. I glanced down at him. He was grinning, pleased, shoulders hunched with concentration. The water in front of us was shallow and stretched out farther than it looked, smooth enough to hide how treacherous it could be if you didn't know it well. I knew it well. I'd grown up coming here. I trusted it. "Doing all right there?" I asked. "Yeah," he said. "It's nibbling." "Good," I replied. "Let it." 3. I laughed softly. "You're going to scare them away if you keep announcing it." He shook his head. "No, they don't mind." I remember that exchange so clearly because it felt so ordinary. That's what makes it hard to talk about now. There was no warning bell, no sense that something was wrong, just a child counting bites and a parent enjoying a quiet evening. 4. The rod tip dipped again, subtle but unmistakable. I watched it this time, feeling that small spark of satisfaction you get when something's actually happening. He had a good spot. Better than mine, apparently. "Don't reel yet?" I said. "Wait for it, I know," he replied patiently. "I'm just counting." 5. The word hung in the air longer than the others. I felt a strange, fleeting discomfort, like I'd missed a step going downstairs. I brushed it off immediately. Kids count, that's all it was. We stood there, the flats stretching out in front of us, the water barely moving. My line stayed quiet. His didn't. 6. I shifted my weight, glancing around. There were a few people farther down, silhouettes against the fading light, but no one close enough to hear us. It was peaceful. Too peaceful, maybe, But that thought came later. "You getting tired?" I asked him. "No," he said. "I want to see how many." 7. The rod tip dipped deeper this time, then rose again. Not a full bite, just contact. I frowned slightly. "That's a lot of nibbles," I said. "Strange they're not committing." He shrugged, eyes still fixed on the line. "Maybe they're just checking." "Checking what?" He thought for a moment. "If it's okay." I opened my mouth to respond, then closed it again. There was something about the way he said it, calm and matter-of-fact, that made my skin prickle. I told myself I was overthinking it. "Eat." I watched the water more closely now, scanning the surface, the subtle patterns of movement. Nothing looked out of place. Still, I felt a growing urge to move, to suggest we try another spot. I didn't act on it. 9. While my chest tightened. "All right," I said lightly. "That's enough counting." Reel in slow. He didn't move. "It hasn't finished yet," he said. "What hasn't?" "The counting." Before I could respond, the rod tip dipped again, sharper than before. 10. I reached out and rested my hand on his shoulder, feeling how still he'd gone. "Okay," I said. "That's plenty. Let's see what you've got." He finally looked up at me then, and there was something in his eyes I didn't recognize. Not fear, not excitement, something else, focused, listening. "They stopped," he said. I frowned. "What stopped?" "The bites." As if on cue, the rod went completely still. No movement, no tension, just slack line resting on the surface. "That happens," I said, though my voice sounded strange to my own ears. "They lose interest." He shook his head slowly. "No, they didn't leave." I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. "What do you mean?" "They're not here anymore," he said. "They're gone." I looked out over the flats again, suddenly aware of how quiet it was. Even the distant sounds seemed muted, like someone had turned the volume down. "Reel in," I said, firmer now. He did, obediently, the line coming back clean and empty. No bait left on the hook. I stared at it, unsettled. "That's odd," I muttered. He didn't respond. He was watching the water again, eyes tracking something I couldn't see. "We'll move spots," I said. "Come on." We packed up quickly. I didn't know why I felt rushed, only that I did. As we walked back toward the path, he kept looking over his shoulder. "They don't like being counted," he said suddenly. "Who doesn't?" I asked. "The water," he replied. "It doesn't like when you notice." I stopped walking and crouched in front of him, forcing a smile. "Hey, you're just tired, that's all." He nodded, but he didn't look convinced. That night, I dreamed of numbers sinking beneath the surface, one by one, disappearing into dark water that never filled up. A few days later, the flats were cordoned off. I was at home when I heard the news. A brief mention on the local report about divers being called in after something was spotted during low tide. I felt that same cold knot tighten in my stomach. They found evidence of a drowning that hadn't been reported. A body weighted down, hidden where the water moved just enough to keep it concealed. The investigation unfolded slowly, details emerging in fragments. Someone had gone in there and never come back out. Someone had made sure of it. When they released the location, my breath caught. It was exactly where my son had been fishing. I sat him down that evening, heart pounding, and asked him to tell me again what he'd felt, what he'd noticed. He listened carefully, then shrugged. "The bites were counting too," he said. "They were telling me how long." "How long for what?" I asked. He looked at me, confused. "Until it stopped." I held him close after that, longer than he liked, my mind racing through every moment on those flats. The subtle dips of the rod, the steady rhythm, the sudden silence. Later, when the investigation concluded, the police confirmed what had happened. The concealed drowning had disturbed the water in small, repetitive ways as the tide shifted, creating movements that could be mistaken for fish bites. Movements that stopped once the tide changed. I understood then, in a way I hadn't before, how thin the line is between the harmless and the horrific. How easily the ordinary can brush up against something terrible without announcing itself. We still fish together, but not there. And he doesn't count the bites anymore. Sometimes, though, when the line goes still all at once, I feel my chest tighten, and I remember the way his voice sounded when he said, 10, and how the water fell silent right after. I was still shaking salt off the line when I noticed the footprints beside mine, pressed clean and deep into the thin crust along the harbor edge. I stopped mid-step, one boot lifted, because for a second my brain refused to accept what my eyes were showing me. I had walked out alone. I was walking back alone. Yet there they were, another set, the same size as mine, matching my stride perfectly, turning with me as I turned away from the water. I stood there longer than made sense, heart thudding hard enough that I could feel it in my throat. The harbor behind me was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels heavier at night, like sound itself is holding its breath. I looked back toward the water, half expecting to see someone standing there, but the edge was empty. My fishing gear lay where I had left it. Nothing disturbed, no voices, no movement. I told myself it had to be old tracks. Someone else earlier, maybe walking the same path, except the snow had been clean when I arrived, smoothed by wind and cold. I remembered that clearly. I remembered checking the ground for my own prints as I went out, a habit I picked up after years of working near the water. These weren't old. The edges were sharp, fresh. I lowered my foot slowly, placing it down inside my own print, and took another step. The other set advanced with me. Step for step, same spacing, same depth. I felt a cold prickle crawl up my back. "Stop it," I muttered, mostly to myself. I crouched, squinting at the impressions. My prints showed the worn tread of my boots, a small chip on the heel. The other prints showed the same pattern, the same chip. That made my stomach drop. Someone else couldn't have the same wear mark unless they were wearing my boots, and I was wearing them. I straightened fast and turned in a slow circle, scanning the harbor edge, the stacked crates, the dark shapes of boats resting against the docks. Nothing moved. The air felt thick, pressing against my ears. I became acutely aware of my breathing, too loud, too fast. I started walking again, slower now, forcing myself not to run. The second set stayed with me, never getting closer, never falling behind. When I stopped, they stopped. When I took a longer stride, they stretched to match it. It was like watching a mirror lag by a fraction of a second. My thoughts raced, trying to latch onto anything logical. Reflection, wind, some trick of light. None of it fit. I'd spent my whole life in Sicilian. I knew how the harbor behaved. I knew what was normal. This wasn't it. I reached the path that led back toward the storage sheds and paused. The prince turned with me again, obedient and precise. I swallowed hard. "All right," I said quietly. "If you're there, say something." Nothing answered. The silence felt deliberate. I kept walking, every step a small act of defiance. My muscles were tight, ready to bolt, but I forced myself to stay steady. The sheds loomed ahead, dark against the night. As I drew closer, the ground changed, the snow thinning to packed dirt and gravel. The footprints didn't fade. They continued across the exposed ground, clear as if pressed into soft clay. That was when fear finally took hold, full and undeniable. Snow I could almost explain, bare ground I could not. I stopped again, chest heaving, and looked down. My own prints were scuffed where the gravel resisted, The other set was identical, every skid and twist mirrored. It was like something was tracing me from below, copying me exactly. I backed away from them without turning my back, steps careful, eyes locked on the ground. The prince retreated with me. A sound broke the stillness then, faint but real, a soft scrape from somewhere near the sheds. I flinched and looked up. "Hello?" I called, my voice cracking. The scrape came again, closer now, like something being dragged slowly across concrete, against my better judgment. I followed the sound, my boots crunching softly. The footprints followed. Behind the nearest shed I found the source. A tarp lay crumpled against the wall, its edge caught on a rusted barrel. The scrape had been the fabric shifting in the breeze. Relief washed through me, brief and dizzying. I laughed, a short, shaky sound, and bent to straighten it. That was when I saw what was underneath. At first, my mind refused to make sense of it. Just shapes and shadows, something pale against the dark ground. Then the details snapped into focus, sharp and unforgiving. A body curled on its side, partially wrapped in plastic, one arm bent at an unnatural angle. My breath left me in a rush, and I staggered back, nearly tripping over my own feet. I stared frozen, my thoughts dissolving into static. I knew enough to know this wasn't an accident. The wrapping, the placement. This had been hidden. My gaze dropped, drawn helplessly back to the ground. The footprints led right up to the body. Mine stopped a few paces away. The other set continued, circling it, pacing around in a slow, deliberate loop. "No," I whispered. The realization hit me then, heavy and sickening. Those weren't someone following me. They were someone leaving with me. Someone who had already been there, who had walked away from this place once before, and was doing it again now, using my steps as a guide. I stumbled back, hands shaking as I fumbled for my phone. It took 3 tries to unlock it. I called the authorities and forced myself to speak clearly, to give directions, to explain what I'd found. They told me to stay where I was. I didn't. I couldn't. I backed away slowly until the footprints thinned and finally vanished, where the ground grew too hard to hold them. Only mine remained. The response came fast. Lights, voices, people who knew what to do. I answered questions, gave statements, watched as they worked around the shed. I didn't look at the body again. Later, much later, they told me what they'd pieced together. The man had gone missing weeks earlier. A dispute. A fight near the harbor. He'd been killed elsewhere, then brought here, hidden where no one would think to look. And the footprints? One of the officers asked gently when I told him about them. He nodded, not dismissive, not mocking. "But we've seen things like that," he said. "Shock does strange things. Your mind tries to make sense of danger." I wanted to believe him. I still do, most days. But sometimes, when I walk near the harbor at night, I glance down and see my prints stretching out ahead of me alone, until they aren't. And I remember how perfectly those other steps matched mine, and how they led me exactly where I needed to go.